Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time, and I'm here today to show you how you can make a hooded scarf. Well, really today is about the hood and how you can put it on your scarf. Now, I already have a video out on this particular stitch that I use in this scarf, and I'll link to that video down below, plus a few other ones, plus the whole Crochet 101 playlist for those who are just wanting to get started in crochet and how to understand all this. Just keep in mind that what I'm going to be talking about are for those who already have all the basics down. But you will want to learn this particular stitch pattern I'm using to do this particular design. Got the scarf already all made up, and I want to explain the way I did this particular one. So using that same stitch pattern in that previous video, when I did that, I was making that scarf going this way. So starting from one end and working clear to the other. And because of the way this stitch pattern is, you can still make this scarf this way to add the hood. And the reason why is because the way the stitch rows are at the end of each row look very similar to how they look along the actual working edge of the stitch. So that's one of the reasons I like this stitch pattern, is because it looks the same on the sides, as you can see here, as it does on the top. And then not the bottom though, because if you're on the bottom, you would have to add, where your starting row is from the chain, you would have to go back and add another row on the bottom. And I'm going to get to that in a minute. And like I said, even though I could have done it this way, since I'm using a solid color, I did it this way just so I could explain how I did this. So right here was where I started. So I did about, I think, 183 chains. The beauty about this is you can make it however long you want. So if you want to make a child's, you're going to do less chains than that to get started. And then you work your stitch. So here was my chain stitch, and I worked this way. Then I went back to make it look the same on both sides and added a row on this side here so that it would look the same instead of having a scalloped edge here and a flat edge here. So that would be an important step. Now, the reason why you may want to work lengthwise is so that if you're working with a variegated yarn or a yarn that tends to make stripes, when you're doing a stitch pattern like this, when you go to add the hood, you're going to want that to look basically the same. If you work your scarf from here up, you're going to have stripes that go this way, and then when you put the hood on, the stripes are going to go that way. And again, it only is going to apply if you're working with a variegated yarn. But solid colored yarns like I use here will not matter. What you're going to want to do is fold your scarf. Actually, after you have the length that you want and you have it completed, you're going to fold your scarf in half to find where the center is. Now, it's a good idea to count your shells before you get started, because if you have an uneven amount of shells, then when you find your center, what you should have is a shell right at that center point. If you have an even number like I did, because I had 64 shells, then you're gonna have the two where you're folding it, you're gonna have those line up. And then from that point out, you're going to count out 12 shells altogether. So you're going to count out 12, just as I'm showing in this clip. And then when you get to the 12 stitches out, because you're counting both rows, both sides of the scarf at the same time, you're going to want to mark that with some kind of stitch marker. I always use bobby pins because they're the easiest to put into the yarn and pull back out again. And then go ahead and unfold that. And then you'll start your first stitch from where that first bobby pin is. So before you do that though, one point I want to make is that when you go to put that on there, let me find the edge here. Look at, because this particular stitch pattern has 2 double crochets, a chain 2 space, and a single crochet, make sure you crochet it on the side where the single crochet is on the right hand side, not on the left hand side, so that when you put in your 2 double crochets, that way you're actually continuing that pattern the way it would happen in the scarf and in the body of the hood. So that's going to be very important. And then from there, you just crochet across all the way to that last shell that has the stitch marker in it. And if you had an even number, you'll have 24 shells. If you had an uneven number, you'll have 25 shells. So like I said, when you first fold that in half, you're going to have that one at the end if it's an uneven number, but you're still going to count out 12. So either 24 or 25, there's not going to be a big difference in between. Now, if you're doing one for a smaller child, you're going to want it a little more narrow. So I say about 20 to 21 stitches across. So at that point, when you fold it in half, you're going to count out 10 stitches or 10 shells, and then put your markers and then start your shells from there. So whenever I work into a project, I'm adding yarn or, adding to a new place, there's two ways you can do it. You put your yarn on your hook, you can slip stitch into the stitch you're starting with and do a chain 3 if you're starting off with a double crochet. I almost never do that. I already have my yarn on my hook, and then I do the yarn over and just start working right into the stitch. That might be harder for people who are newer at crochet to do that. You might take a little more experience because you got to learn how to hold that yarn in place, a little slip knot there, so that you can, when you go to make that stitch, it's not sliding around. But I prefer doing that rather than doing the chain 3. But either way, it'll work, because if you do that chain 3, that's going to count as your first double crochet. Then you do the next double crochet, your chain 2, and your single crochet, because that's the shell stitch pattern. For the adult size, you're going to want to do a total of 20 rows back and forth. You do want these to be even number. And for a child's hood, 18 rows seems to be a pretty good number. I mean, this is a pretty simple process. So what I have here is I have just a few more shells to work. So I'm going to finish this out and then show you what I do next. So anyway, here's the stitch pattern. Again, you can go watch that video where I broke it down more slowly. And I'm doing these shells in here. Just got 2 more shells to go to finish out this last or 20th row. And then it's just a matter of completing the hood. But the first thing I'm going to do is show you what this looks like. I'm going to do a chain 1, basically to lock it. So when you spread it out, you'll see that I've got the scarf and then I've got this big rectangle at the top. So you can see that. So what's going to happen is this rectangle is what's going to actually make the hood. So you can see the point to the hood is right here. And so then all you have to do is do a slip stitch across your work. And of course, this will then become the inside of the hood. So you have your seam on the inside. And don't use a smaller hook to do this, or you're going to pull the thing too tight and it's going to look bunchy. So make sure you work with the same size hook, and then just do a slip stitch in each of the 2 stitches from each side of the hood all the way across. So basically you're picking up the back loop on the one and the back loop on the other. You can also go through both, but I find it best to go through the back loops from each row, from each side, that is. Let me go ahead and explain that slip stitch. So you're just putting the yarn through the loop of each side, yarn over, and then pull that loop up. That's your slip stitch. It's that simple. And then just keep working that all the way across until you get to the end. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this out so I can show you what it looks like when it's done. Okay, so then when I get to the end of any work that I'm doing, doesn't matter what it is, I always add a chain stitch. And that is to help lock it off. And cut your yarn, and then you're going to just simply work that in. I'll show you, I'm sure I've done it in other videos, I'll show you how I work my ends in. Basically what I do is I get a smaller hook and just crochet them back in. I at least do a few stitches like that. And then if I have any other ends that are close by where I can actually tie them together, I will tie them. I know that the book that I learned from how to crochet said you never use knots. Well, I do, because anything I did that had knots they ended up working out of the stuff, and I would, the things I made for people, I went back and repaired them for them and then put knots in them. And doing the little crochet, that's one of the best ways, instead of just doing the standard weaving in. Crocheting it in is going to really lock that in place. And then you, after a few of those, you can just pull it through like that. And as long as that's on the inside, it's not such a big deal. So that's the inside part of the hood. You can see the seam there. And I just turn it that way. And there is, I still got a couple, this end here to work in. That's the only other end I have left to work in, is where I started the work on this side. Okay, so one thing about working this stitch pattern that can help you keep track of your rows, how many you've done, is each one of these fully rounded scallops represents 2 rows. So if you look close, you can see 1 row, 2 rows. So that's a good way to count it. So 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on. And there's how the top of that looks. You can still see the seam, but I find doing that back stitch makes it just lay flatter than if I had not. But that's going to be all up to you. And as you can see, I've already put the fringe on this using a couple of contrasting colors, because I decided I did not want this scarf to be fully just a solid burgundy. And the reason I chose those colors is because they're the same colors that are in the flowers that I'm going to put on this. So I think I'm going to put them somewhere on the scarf body. Then I usually will put a button in the middle of these, and then I'll use the same color yarn as the scarf itself. So I sew through the button, through the flower, tie my knots back in here, crochet, tie a knot, then I take the ends and bring them back to this side underneath the flower. I do have a separate video on how to make flowers, and I'll link to that down below as well. So that's just a little added thing that you can do. I'll show you the finished picture here, and you can see what I decided on and how it looks with the flowers and the buttons and all. Now, what I'm making these recent projects for is that we've got the local caring place has an auction every February, so I'm just getting a few things ready to put in the auction to help them raise money to help young moms, especially for those who are financially strapped, to be able to take care of their young children, their babies. So usually they have cribs, clothes, and different things ready for them. They also will work with them, teach them various things. And so I always try to donate to this every year. And so I wanted to get a few different projects done. So this is going to go in there. The kitty hat that I made in my last series is going to go in there. And then just some other little ideas you can think, like I mentioned, the kitty ears. They're a little harder to get something like that put onto a hat and that's a stitch like this that is a little looser, and compared to your single crochet, you can still sew them on there easy enough. There's just not as many stitches to sew onto, and they're not as stable, but you can make it work with careful stitching. And so you can take some of the ideas that I used in the previous hat series and look at some of those, any little added things, you know, like the flowers or whatever, and just be creative with it. I've even done scarves where instead of making a flower, I simply put a button where you put the scarf on, or the hooded scarf, and you have a button where you can wrap it over and then button it in a couple. Usually I put 2 buttons like this, so that then the scarf would hold in place, because you know how a lot of times you're wearing a scarf, you got it wrapped over and then it just keeps coming undone. That would be an option, or put it so that it can button like back over here. And then this hood will also work on the hooded cowl idea. I came up with a pattern for those. And those ones I typically used either a cross stitch, which is a double crochet just crossed over, and I do have a video where I talk about that in the 101 series, or just a regular double crochet, because that's going to work up a lot faster. I've done it where I put bear ears on it because I had a specific request for ones with cat ears, ones with bear ears. So the hood idea, same idea, the way you're going to work it into the end of whatever it is you're making. So for the cowl, it's basically just a short scarf that you're going to put buttons on, and you can make it as wide as you want, but then you're just going to work that hood on there that same way. Figure out how wide you want it to be, how many stitches wide, and then just work your rows back and forth and stitch the top together. And then for like when I was using the double crochet or the cross stitch, then I would put some kind of border around it, the whole thing, to make it look better, especially when you're doing the fox hat. I did the fox one, was a pretty popular one. Then having the border of the off-white and then the black just really made it stand out. So there's a couple of ideas there on as far as the hooded scarf goes. So it's a pretty simple to do. I've also put hoods onto, it was a pattern I found online for free years ago. That's where I got all of my sweater patterns I found for free online just by searching. And this was quite a number of years ago. And then made myself a bunch of sweaters. Some of them I found from drops. Some of them I found through Ravelry.com. Some of them were no longer available, but I did go back and gather up the ones I could, the links to them. So for those people who are asking for the sweater patterns, those were not mine. And that includes the shawl pattern. I think I got the shawl pattern link gathered up too. If I don't, I'll try to find it and see if I can get it in there. But I put them all in one place on my Patreon. And yes, it's free. You don't have to donate. You don't have to sign up. I make everything there public, so people can just go in there and see my posts. So you don't have to pay a dime to see any of my posts on Patreon. So anyway, I'll put the link to that down below if you'd like to look at those sweater patterns, and hopefully that shawl pattern will be in there. But anyway, I took that same shawl pattern and did it the same way, but then made the hood attaching it the same way. I just had to figure out how far out onto the shawl, onto the shoulders of the shawl, I needed to start working that hood. So you can see a picture or two of it here and how it turned out. I've done a few that way. So I'll put a few different pictures here using that same pattern and then adding the hood to it. So anyway, I hope you're enjoying these crochet videos. That's why I'm getting some of these out right now. It's just because I got different projects and I thought it'd be fun to show you how to do these things. Okay, well, I hope this gives you some ideas and maybe some things you want to make for yourselves, or gift ideas, or even like me, for this sake, I'm making something to put in an auction to help people raise money for a good cause. All right, well, thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.